The Transcendence of Ego and Egoic Society, taken from The Transmission of Doubt by Adi Da Samraj, known then as Darkly John. An essay, May the 6th, 1982. 1. The unenlightened or egocentric body-mind self is founded on the action of self-contraction. The self-contraction is expressed as the differentiation of self from the transcendental source condition and from every other form of presumed not self, and it is likewise expressed via the independent definition of self and the constant concern and search for independent preservation of self. The self-based or self-contracting and self-preserving conception of existence is manifested by the psychology of fear and conflict relative to all that is not self. Therefore, the psychology of egocentric existence is inherently disposed to seek control and dominance over all that is not self. For this reason, individual lives are a constant expression of anxiety, mechanically involved in techniques of self-manipulation in order to preserve self and other manipulation, in order to control or dominate whatever is not self. The moods of human egoity are always very close to fear, sorrow, and anger, and the collective or group life of egocentric human beings is likewise dominated by the same exclusiveness and the same motives towards self-preservation and control of what is outside. Human societies are always tending to be modelled after the unenlightened pattern of the individual ego. The political and social systems of the present-day world are not generated by literally enlightened or even highly evolved leaders, ideals, or institutions. We live in the samsaric or unenlightened world of egoic society, and this is why the signs of the times are so profoundly negative. The entire world is now nearly out of control with egoic motives. Mankind, tutored by materialistic philosophies, ego-serving technologies, and gross political idealisms, is possessed by the mechanical efforts of self-indulgence, depressed by the frustration of the inherently spiritual motives of being anxious for the achievement of release, and trapped in the devices of anger. The ego, whether individual or collective, is eventually reduced to sorrow and despair by the inability of life to generate happiness, with a capital H, and joy and immortality. And that self-contained depression finally becomes anger or angry confrontation with the total world and every form of not self, including the transcendental identity or condition, which is made into an other by the egoic mind and thus conceived via the conventional or merely exoteric ideas about God. And when anger becomes the mood of societies, the quality of fire, or the primitive and destructive intents of the frustrated ego invades the plane of humanity. That fire is expressed as all of the sufferings and all of the painful illusions of mankind, including all of the ego-based politics of confrontation, and it is finally summarized in the acts of war. 2. The differentiation of existence into self-possessed units yields, in the case of each one, the craving for entirely pleasurized and unthreatened existence. This craving or obsessive motive of self-preservation and self-glorification in turn yields inevitable conflict, fear, sorrow, anger, and all kinds of destructive acts in relation to others as well as to self, because the extreme exercise of self-preservation is ultimately an aggressive and self-defeating motivation that destroys the self in the final effort to dominate the not-self. Therefore, all egos, or unenlightened centers of identity, whether individual or collective, are in aggressive conflict with all other egos and all that is not self, or outside the defined egoic center. All individual and collective egos are involved in programs of self-destruction via patterns of self-possession, self-seeking, self-indulgence, reactive emotion, unenlightened thinking, and so forth, as well as other destruction by all kinds of reactive activity based on self-concern that seeks to control and ultimately dominate whatever is outside the self-center. The search for the independent preservation and ultimate enhancement of self is a universal model of unenlightened egoity. Therefore, suffering, power struggle, and war are inevitable in egoic society. And if the capability for political manipulation and war becomes technologically profound, universal suppression via aggressive political efforts and universal destruction via war become the common expectation and destiny of all human beings. We live in just such a time of technological sophistication in which the egoic model of man and human society is the universal basis of mind. Gross materialism in science and politics gives human beings no option in the mind except that of the trapped and threatened animal. Therefore, a fiery mood is abroad, full of gross desire, frustration, fear, despair, and aggressive reactivity. The egoic motive of self-preservation is approaching its most destructive mood, the mood that appears in the moment of ultimate entrapment. In that mood, there is no longer any will to preserve self or world or any others. Therefore, there is simply explosive fire based on the deep motives of egoic self-preservation, but reduced to action that is most primitive of wholly destructive of both self and not self. In the collective mind of humanity, in the present and growing extremes of entrapment, the explosion of great nuclear bombs merely represents the archetype of anger itself. And it is for this reason that the possibility of a nuclear holocaust in the extreme moment of the new rising political confrontations is an irrational and therefore entirely possible, if not inevitable, event. Past societies have, in their extreme moments of confrontation, destroyed themselves as well as their opponents. This is because ego-based societies function in essentially the same manner as egoic individuals. Individual human beings kill others and themselves every day. Therefore, groups and societies confronting one another in egoic fashion likewise threaten one another with destruction. And in the extreme moments of a confrontation, when self-preservation achieves its peak of righteous irrationality, it is profoundly likely that nuclear war will result. The motives of present-day society are the same as those of past societies. The only difference is that in the present day, the technology of confrontation has become profound. Therefore, when confrontation reaches its peak of irrationality, our war motives will willingly destroy the entire world, just as readily as, in the past, less technologically sophisticated war makers have wiped their petty tribes from the face of the earth. 3. Many people are now trying to influence governments to abandon nuclear weapons. But even if they succeed, irrational individuals and groups can still threaten and destroy the common order with terrorist tactics and homemade bombs. And the limited or non-nuclear warfare that might still erupt between governments that agree not to make nuclear war is just as much a threat to us all as any nuclear war. It is time that we accept the political necessity for an end to confrontation politics. We must abandon our ancient egoic principles and renounce our political, social and cultural provincialism. Individuals within the collective order of mankind may yet suffer the unenlightened and immature disabilities of egocentric personality, but the governments themselves, as well as institutions and leaders in every area of human endeavour, must abandon the egocentric, subhuman, merely materialistic, non-cooperative and intolerant or loveless posture and style of life. Indeed, we must all demand that a new leadership of this kind come forward and accept responsibility for the representation of our interests. Haven't we had enough of the brute, stupid, childish and exploitative representation of our existence that is played out daily in our name and on our lives by governments, politicians, materialists, scientists, technocrats, social planners, educators, exoteric and fundamentalist religionists, who aggressively propagate and the provincial and pharisaical religions of ego salvation rather than practice the universal and ego-transcending religion of love, and media hypers who thrive on the invention and exaggeration of conflict and dramatize our worst instincts in the eternal gotcha game that denudes and exposes and trivializes both the highs and the inevitable lows in the dynamic effort of humankind. Isn't it evident in your deepest feeling psyche that this wisdom-renouncing world is being controlled by our worst and most superficial conceptions of existence? It is time for us to understand ourselves and reclaim the world from the dictatorship of the ego and from all of those who play at politics and life in general as if it was a sporting event that is supposed to excite and entertain us all on television. Nuclear disarmament is a relatively positive but still too superficial effort. It is not a curative means, but only another palliative and temporary move in the midst of our traditional advance toward future trouble. There is something more fundamental than the disarmament politics whereby enemies come to a gentlemanly agreement on how to kill one another without destroying one another. What is more fundamental, necessary and curative is that we understand and transcend that which is in us that makes us confront one another as opponents and enemies. It may sound naive to speak of the necessity for the present childish and brutishly adolescent crowd of governments and institutions to understand themselves and renounce the self-imagery and the techniques of enemies, but the feeling that it is naive to speak in such terms is a reflection of our egoic frustration and despair. We must transcend that very frustration and despair if we are going to prevent the enslavement and destruction of mankind. Humanity is now living in bondage to egocentric and materialistic idealisms that are suppressing our human freedom to live by wisdom and realize the truth. If we do not shake loose from the regime, we are going to suffer the extreme fulfillment of collective egoic destiny in a narcissistic holocaust that will either enslave mankind via a technologically robotinized political and social order, or else destroy mankind by technologically engineered warfare. It is not naive to demand a new leadership when those who are led number in the billions. Nor is it folly to try to educate mankind when the only alternative is slavery and death. Therefore, I say to you that we must all commit ourselves to understand the patterns by which we are now and have traditionally been living, both individually and collectively, so that we can then change those patterns and the destinies those patterns will inevitably inflict upon us. The egoic model must be educated out of the collective order of mankind. A new leadership must appear which is awakened to an understanding of the primitive egoic basis of the present and traditional collective order. That new leadership must, above all, provide an educative role, and it must transform the techniques whereby governments and societies enter into relations with one another. Only such a leadership can, by strategies based on the wit of free intelligence, cause all the governments and institutions of the world to voluntarily change toward a cooperative and benign mode of association with others. And this can be done by establishing profoundly undesirable economic and other practical consequences for not participating in the cooperative process. If this kind of approach is not made soon, we will be entering into the most destructive period of political confrontation in human history. Remember, this was back in 1982, so that's 44 years ago or so. Look at today. 4. An enlightened or non-egoic and at least higher evolutionary, if not spiritual and transcendental, view of existence, and thus of politics, must soon arise in the leadership of mankind. At the present time, we are all being led to enslavement and destruction by enlightened materialists and self-seekers in every area of common human endeavour. The ideal of wisdom has been replaced by the ideal of knowledge, and knowledge has come to mean traditional science, or all that can be achieved or supported exclusively by the intellectual efforts of materialistic philosophy. Science, which has traditionally identified itself with the archaic and false philosophy of materialism, has itself thus become identical to technology, or the materialistic machine of the known, and materialistic technology, along with its like in the form of all the materialistic idealisms that appeal to human egoity, has become the primary instrument for the political manipulation and control of collective humanity. The political ideals and means of the present time are materialistic, based on a gross and egoic conception of human existence. There simply cannot be any ultimately effective change in our collective situation until a new leadership arises that is founded on the intelligence and higher evolutionary capacity of ego transcendence and, ultimately, the wisdom of non-sectarian, spiritual and transcendental enlightenment. Only such a leadership can rightly educate the collective order and relieve it of the burden of the egoic and materially confined view of life. And only such a leadership can transform the technique of governments from a process of self-preserving and other controlling confrontation of their own members as well as other societies, to a process of cooperation, unification, and a worldwide creative order based on pluralism, tolerance, and freedom. The problem of the automatic and even unconscious creation of suffering and destruction is inherent in the egocentric form of individual existence. It is this principle that I call you to observe and understand. We must learn from this observation of the ego in personal and collective terms, and so equip ourselves to freely abandon the egoic model of existence. This essay has, thus far, primarily spoken to the necessity for such education and change at the level of the leadership and collective order of mankind. Now I must move on to consider the implications of this education at the level of individual practice. 5. The ego is self-contraction, or the conversion of manifest existence away from the free orientation to its source, or real condition, and so back upon the individual centre of functional experience. I see that this conversion represents the orientation, habit, the destiny described by the myth of Narcissus, which I propose as a symbol for the process of egocentrism. The egocentric form of conditional existence is a kind of entrapment that leads only to more and more elaborate and confining as well as deluding states of limited and unenlightened psychophysical personality. In the egocentric form, conditional existence cannot locate happiness, truth, or reality, but it is confined entirely to the visions and sufferings of independent selfhood. Therefore, many who have seen this to be so have called humanity to escape conditional existence itself by a strategy of self-suppressed means. What I call for is self-observation, self-understanding, and self-transcendence in the midst of free participation in the play of conditional existence. If this is done, the motives either to exploit or to escape the conditional self are inherently transcended. A more natural course of life practice develops on the basis of the orientation of self-transcendence rather than self-exploitation or self-suppression. And that practice leads naturally to the blissful and free realization of the real or transcendental condition in which there is inherent transcendence of self and world. We must observe and understand the self as contraction. We must see the self-contraction operating inherently in pain as all the kinds of conditional desire, reactive emotion, conflict, and destructive aggressiveness, rather than creative and liberating power. On the basis of this observation and understanding of self, or the individuated psychophysical personality, we should freely abandon the principle and the strategies of egocentricity. We should yield the body, mind, and attention to that condition, capital C, which precedes the self-contraction, that transcendental freedom, capital F, love, bliss, happiness, capital H, consciousness, capital C, and being, capital B, in and from which the self-contraction is generated in each moment. By our practicing self-observation, self-understanding, and self-transcendence in every moment of manifest conditional and relational existence, the habit and the effects of egocentricity are gradually released, thereby liberating energy and attention for the realization of the freedom, love, bliss, happiness, consciousness, or being that is the real state and ultimate condition of self and not self. And that realization ultimately translates existence from the domain of conditional nature and into the domain of transcendental or divine fullness. This way of ultimate practice may not be accepted by many in the yet adolescent age of man, but at least the principles of the way in terms of abandoning the gross style of ego-based political confrontations and ego-based social participation or non-participation must become a matter of practical commitment on the part of the leaders and educators of mankind, or else we will collectively move toward intolerable enslavement and even nuclear destruction. Therefore, I call everyone to consider at least the political and broad social fulfillment of the way that I teach via ego-transcending tolerance and creative cooperation. Beyond this, I call and look for those who can understand and utterly transcend the pattern and destiny of the self in this world and all higher or subtler worlds. I am calling and looking for those who will go beyond the outward and bodily improvement of self and its world, and who will also go beyond the inward and ascending improvement of self in the higher or subtler worlds. I am calling and looking for those who will go directly to the source condition of self in all worlds. I am here to serve everyone with ego-transcending understanding, but I am especially looking for those who will embrace the way in its ultimate form, so that the ultimate form of the way may be fulfilled by them and passed on by them to future generations. The ultimate form of the way is the free or non-problematic and non-strategic renunciation of self based on the intelligence of direct understanding. It is not the ascetical self-suppressive or, in effect, suicidal path, which is not based on inherently self-transcending understanding, but on the egoic presumption of a problem to be strategically escaped. The radical way of understanding is not strategically self-destructive and world-denying. It is based on participatory intelligence, expressed as love and surrender, and matured as simplicity and freedom. The path of this egocentric world is recognizable as suffering, delusion, fear, and death. Even all resistance to self and world only reinforces the self-mind, and the strategy of resistance only duplicates suffering in its stark disciplines. The way that I teach inherently transcends confrontation with self and world. It is the way of inherent peace, not the fruitless search for peace. That peace is beyond all understanding, but it cannot be realized except through understanding. Da, da, da. Adi Da Samraj is an essay on transcending ego and ego society. This is what everyone is separating themselves from. Already love, already peace, already joy, already intimate. By doing this self-contraction, we're pulling ourselves away and we're escaping and we're avoiding conditional life. We must embrace conditional life from the disposition of love, of already happiness, without being aggressive, without war, without the indulgence that we need others to make us happy, for we are already happy. Da.